This is a story of Cuvier and Blue Peter, a Cornish blue tit couple, and their 3 surviving chicks, Milktop, Sky and Acorn. A story full of wholesome moments, heartbreaking turns, and a quiet, beautiful resilience. I hope that through sharing in their journey, you, like me, can gain a greater insight into the life and behaviour of blue tits, find answers to some questions, and perhaps even uncover a few new mysteries about this fascinating species. Blue tits are a familiar sight across Europe and thrive in the UK's woodlands, hedgerows, parks and gardens. They nest in holes and crevices and will readily move into a well-placed garden nest box. I put a lot of thought into mine. It was built from sturdy wood fitted with a metal ring to protect the entrance from predators and mounted at the right height and on a wall to stay out of reach of cats. And I positioned it on the shaded side of the garden to help keep it cool during warm spells. The camera setup was carefully chosen, compact, reliable and designed not to overheat, safely housed in a separate compartment with no exposed wires, and with it a lot of hope that a family might choose this box as their home. Amazingly, just a few days after the box went up in early March, a male and female blue tit began to show interest. Introducing Cuvier and Blue Peter. More on their names later. They visited every morning between 7:30 and 10:30 for 2 weeks, inspecting the box carefully and repeatedly pecking around the entrance hole. In fact, they must have spent hours in total pecking at the edge of the doorway. Curious about this behaviour, I did some research. While I couldn't find any academic studies on it, various ornithological websites suggest a few possible explanations. It may be a form of ritualised behaviour carried over from nesting in natural tree cavities that need reshaping to suit their needs. It could also be a way of testing the strength of the wood or even a method of marking territory, showing other birds that this nest box is taken. From my own observations, it seemed most likely that they were trying to modify the entrance hole to their liking. I've also seen photographs of nest boxes made from thinner wood, without protective metal rings, where blue tits have significantly enlarged the hole themselves. What's especially intriguing is that, as you'll see later in the video, the female, Cuvier, continues tapping at the entrance while feeding her young. This raises new questions. Is this behaviour of pecking at the doorway different during chick rearing, and if so, why and what does it mean? On their 15th day of visits, something changed. Cuvier and Blue Peter began returning to the box throughout the day, not just in the mornings. At one point, Cuvier even tried to bring in a long twig that didn't quite fit through the entrance. They brought in bits of moss, then took them back out again. This kind of back and forth is common. Blue tits carefully assess the quality of the materials they collect, often removing anything that's damp, dirty, or otherwise unsuitable. This attention to detail reduces the risk of parasites, which are common in nests and can seriously harm both eggs and chicks. Their instinctive care helps keep the nest clean, dry and safe, improving the chances that their young will thrive. The nest building itself is usually carried out by the female, but the male may contribute too, and Blue Peter certainly did his fair share. This pattern of bringing in moss and then removing much of it continued until the end of March. On the 1st of April, 21 days after first inspecting the box and 6 days after beginning the nest building, they were bringing in material well into the evening, and that night, for the first time, Cuvier slept overnight in the nest. As always, Blue Peter roosted in a nearby dense shrub or tree close to the nesting site. From this point on, sleeping in the nest box became a routine for Cuvier, leaving at just after 6:30 each morning. Instead of most of the moss being taken out, the amount inside the nest began to steadily increase and take shape. Around this time, the female, Cuvier, regularly started performing the nesting shuffle, a behaviour where she shifts and rearranges the nesting material with her body. This shuffle helps compact and shape the moss and other soft materials into a snug, insulated cup designed to keep eggs and chicks warm and secure throughout incubation and beyond. They began to line the nest box with feathers and fur 19 days after the first piece of moss had been brought in. Preparations continued until, on the 22nd of April, 42 days after Cuvier and Blue Peter first explored the nest box, Cuvier laid her first egg. Blue tits typically lay their eggs in the morning, often starting shortly after dawn. They usually lay one egg per day until the clutch is complete, which commonly consists of around 7 to 12 eggs. Each egg is carefully incubated once the full clutch is laid, ensuring the best chance for the chicks to develop and hatch together. In Cuvier's case, at least 8 eggs were laid. The nest box was conveniently situated about 10 feet from an opposite cherry tree, with the garden itself surrounded by 3 larger trees approximately 40 feet from the box. Besides assisting with foraging and feeding, Blue Peter spent much of his time perched in these trees, defending the territory and alarm calling when necessary, typical behaviour for a male blue tit. The pair nearly always landed in the cherry tree before flying across to the nest box each time they visited, whereas when leaving they would fly directly from the nest box towards their destination. The first hatching took place early in the morning on the 10th of May after 18 days of incubation. Within the next few days, 7 chicks hatched, leaving 1 visible unhatched egg. Newly hatched blue tit chicks are around 1.5 to 2 centimeters long and weigh only about 1 gram, roughly the weight of a paperclip. At this stage, they are extremely delicate, with closed eyes, translucent pink skin, and no feathers. Their size and vulnerability make the protection and warmth of the nest and the care from their parents absolutely critical in these early days. Cuvier and Blue Peter, of course, tentatively cared for the chicks. Cuvier kept them warm, fussed over the nest, keeping it clean and perfectly arranged, and Blue Peter brought food deliveries which he passed to Cuvier, who then in turn fed the chicks. Or if Cuvier was out foraging herself, he would carefully feed the chicks. However, very early in this process something changed. On the evening of the 14th of May, just a few days after the chicks hatched, Blue Peter stopped bringing food into the nest box. At first I hoped it was a change in routine, that maybe Blue Peter was entering but only when Cuvier was not inside. I was concerned, along with the rest of the live nest box community. We wondered if perhaps the feeding pattern had changed, and Blue Peter was now passing food to Cuvier at the entrance or nearby, rather than entering the box himself. However, after careful inspection of hours of footage, both inside the nest box inspecting behaviour and outside of the nest box using a more high quality camera to look at the detail of the bird or birds coming and going, it became very clear that Cuvier was the only bird entering the box, and that Blue Peter was not visiting at all. Having observed the two so closely for hour upon hour, each day from my studio window, I knew that something was wrong. I couldn't see Blue Peter in any of his usual spots in the garden, not in the cherry tree opposite the box, not giving alarm calls or defending the territory, as he had so reliably done up until this point. In fact, I didn't see or hear him again. I had one moment of hope. I was watching the nest box camera and at the same time keeping my eye on the garden, and I saw a blue tit in the box, and I also saw one drinking at the bird bath. For a moment I thought that he had returned. I then realised the camera feed was delayed. There was no bird in the box at the same time one was drinking. It was Cuvier at the bird bath. Blue Peter had worked hard to defend his family, care for Cuvier, and tend to his young, and not knowing what had happened to him was heartbreaking. Blue tits do not typically abandon their families, so at this point I assumed this was an illustration of what happens all too often in a wildlife-unfriendly society. Traffic, domestic cats, disease, window collisions, or possibly natural predators. These can all suddenly claim the lives of small birds. Something remarkable, though, is the resilience of the partner left behind. While loss of a parent, especially the female, as she keeps the chicks warm, can result in the death of all the young, the ability for one parent to do the job of two is incredible. Cuvier adapted immediately, even though her job had become immensely harder. With two parents, the male will defend the territory and forage, while the female broods the chicks and also does some foraging. This is especially important when they're young. Now she had to do all of these things, a difficult balance, especially in fluctuating temperatures and with growing food demand, not to mention taking care of herself. Not only that, she no longer had Blue Peter guarding the garden. Thankfully, being able to watch the nest box from my studio, I was able to help out with this, unbeknown to Cuvier. As mentioned before exiting the nest box, Cuvier would tap at the doorway. It has been suggested that this is to check there are no predators around before leaving, and this could be the case. I'd be interested to learn more about this. Despite Cuvier's hard work, very sadly, 3 of the 7 chicks died over the next few days. Cuvier removed them quickly, always in the early hours, taking them far from the nest to keep the space clean and reduce the risk of predators. Death of chicks is not uncommon, and with her doing the role of 2, this is not surprising, and I watched with concern, wondering the fate of the 4 remaining chicks. Now you may be wondering about Cuvier's name. The lovely live nest box community named our dedicated blue tit family, and Cuvier was named after Cuvier's beaked whale, a species known for its incredible deep diving abilities. You may have noticed how unusually deep this blue tit nest is. While the extra depth likely helped keep the chicks cozy and well protected, especially as Cuvier was out foraging more than she would have been if Blue Peter had been around, it also meant that Cuvier had to dive right down into the nest cavity again and again to feed the chicks, check on them, remove their fecal sacks and keep the space clean. The effort she made, repeatedly plunging into the mossy depths, sometimes even tipping upside down, earned her her name. After losing 3 of her chicks, Cuvier continued to work tirelessly to care for the remaining 4, but on the 18th of May, when the chicks were around 8 days old, something tragic happened. A feather had become stuck to the length of one of the chicks' bodies, making it difficult for the chick to lift its head properly to feed. Cuvier did manage to feed the chick, and I hoped the feather would become dislodged. However, that afternoon while breeding the chicks, Cuvier attempted to fly up and out of the nest box, only to realise she was stuck. The same feather that clung to the chick had also caught onto her, meaning they were stuck together and she couldn't pull away. For about 4 agonising minutes, she struggled desperately, flapping and pulling in an attempt to free herself. Eventually, she did manage to break free, but by then, sadly, the poor chick had been killed in the struggle. Having once seen a video where a blue tit destroyed her whole nest in a desperate effort to escape entanglement, it was a relief to see that Cuvier, despite the trauma, freed herself calmly and returned to tend to her surviving chicks. Still, it was a deeply sad moment, all caused by a single sticky feather, and a stark reminder of how important nest cleanliness can be for a bird's safety. The 3 remaining chicks were doing well with Cuvier's wonderful parenting. She alternated between brooding and feeding them. As the chicks grew older and stronger, they needed less breeding and could be left alone for longer while she went out to forage. However, this period was not without drama. On one occasion, as Cuvier flew out of the nest box, 2 chicks were accidentally pulled from the nest, stuck to her as she left. Thankfully, they weren't pulled out of the box. Instead, they landed on the soft bedding outside the nest cup, where they found each other and cuddled for warmth. Though Cuvier wasn't nearby when they began moving, the two wriggly, vulnerable chicks slowly made their way back toward their home. One chick managed to return to the nest cup before Cuvier came back, but the other remained outside, giving her quite a shock when she spotted him. Though the camera recording failed, thankfully live viewers were able to see that just after she left the box again, he too found his way safely back inside. While newly hatched chicks have limited vision and movement, blue tits, like all animals, are created with instinct, which in this case drove the chicks to seek warmth and safety. This instinct saved their lives, as being so small and still featherless, the chicks needed constant brooding, and failing to get back into the cup would have been fatal. As the three chicks grew, gained feathers and opened their eyes, the live nest box community named them Milktop, Sky and Acorn. Milktop's name is a tribute to an intriguing chapter in blue tit history. In the 20th century, when milk was delivered to doorsteps in glass bottles, blue tits became famous for their cleverness in pecking through the foil tops to reach the rich cream inside. Because of the deep nest, chick development could only be observed in glimpses, when they reached up for food, or once big enough when they hopped out for an adventure. Milktop was the first to explore outside of the nest cup, being the most developed. By this point, Milktop was about 20 days old. And as you can see, by this stage, blue tit chicks have transformed dramatically. They have begun to develop feathers, gained some colouring, and their eyes are fully open, bright and alert. They are much more active, hopping around the nest and beginning to explore their surroundings. Their wings are growing stronger, preparing for their first tentative flights. By the 29th of May, Cuvier had stopped breeding them at night, a sign that the chicks could now regulate their own body temperature. Milktop, the largest chick, who had likely not only hatched a day or two before the smallest, was also the strongest and boldest, and therefore received much of the food Cuvier brought into the nest. Some say that blue tits will simply give the food to the beaks they see, but I did observe Cuvier many times sharing the food evenly with her chicks. However, the deep nest meant that the smallest chick, and sometimes even the middle chick, were often hidden beneath the lively Milktop. This can be concerning, especially with only one parent feeding, as smaller chicks who go hours without food can lack the right nutrients to grow and can even starve. However, Cuvier persisted. Milktop would hop back into the nest on seeing Mum return, seeing this as the prime feeding spot. But curiosity and energy meant that Milktop began spending more and more time out of the nest, hopping around, practicing using wings for the first time, and eventually exploring the doorway into the big wide world. In the nest box, the chicks began exploring what was around them in their small world, practicing using their tiny beaks by picking up items in the nest, looking at a tiny black dot on the wall, and tentatively pecking one of the metal screws, which seemed to fascinate each in turn as they grew. On the 30th of May, around 20 days after hatching, Milktop took a first mini flight, and only 2 days later, after encouragement from Cuvier in the form of not feeding and softly calling from the outside, Milktop fledged. Milktop was the most developed of the three by the time of fledging, and after spending time on the garden fence next to the cherry tree, flew into the safety of a nearby garden. The next morning, I could see Cuvier taking food over the top of one of the garden's bordering trees. At first, she seemed to be prioritising Milktop, now in a vulnerable position and needing to quickly learn to fly, hide and forage. Having one fledged chick and two still in the box, and without Dad to share the duties, feed frequency definitely dropped. Skye, the middle chick, especially, had been mimicking Milktop's boisterous behaviour, but with fewer feeds and no older sibling to follow, was noticeably more subdued that morning. Still, signs of readiness were there. At just after 8 a.m, Skye began flying up to the top of the nest box, responding to the soft calls of Cuvier outside. For the next 20 minutes, several times, Skye peered out at the entrance, hesitant but curious. Cuvier increased her efforts to encourage Skye out of the box. Cuvier would land outside the box. She would then fly to a nearby wire or to the cherry tree and call persistently. She would bring food to the entrance, but not give it to Skye. Intermittent blackbird and pigeon activity near the box seemed to cause her to pause. Skye continued to make brief, uncertain visits to the entrance, retreating each time. By 9 a.m, Skye almost took off, but turned back last second. A few more close attempts followed, and Cuvier returned to continue her patient encouragement. At 9:12, after a series of nearly there moments, Skye fledged. And this is when something rather unusual happened. Within about 15 minutes of Skye fledging, and with much calling back and forth between mom and chick, a second adult blue tit appeared in the garden. Cuvier returned to the box to feed Acorn, the remaining chick, and whilst she was in the box, a shadow appeared at the door. Cuvier looked and saw another blue tit peeping in. I was able to observe this both from my studio window, seeing the outside of the box, while simultaneously watching the nest box camera. Cuvier did not become agitated or try to see off the visitor. After this, the two adults were around the garden together for a very short amount of time, less than half an hour, before the mystery visitor disappeared, and Cuvier took over sole responsibility again. Had Blue Peter returned after all this time, or was this a new adult? Whoever this was did not return after this brief visit, and it seemed like a friendly visit, as though the visitor had been attracted to the calls of the newly fledged chicks and Acorn still in the box. Not long after, I spotted a tiny blue tit fledgling, Skye, in the long grass, in the area of my garden I allowed to grow wild. Seeing Skye in the garden put into perspective just how tiny blue tit fledglings are. Unfortunately, however, Skye headed in the opposite direction to Milktop, into a neighbouring garden that turned out to be unsafe for a new fledgling. While interference with wildlife can often cause more harm than good, there are rare, clear-cut situations where stepping in can make a crucial difference, and this was one of them. That afternoon, as I kept an eye on the nest box camera, I became aware that Acorn hadn't been fed for an unusually long amount of time. She had used up a lot of energy earlier, making attempts towards the doorway with Cuvier's encouragement, and now she hadn't been fed for nearly 2 hours. At the same time, I became aware of prolonged blue tit alarm calls coming from a neighbouring garden. Whilst I was used to Cuvier's occasional alarm calls, this one was relentless and had been going on for some time. It became clear that this was different than usual. Cuvier was spending a long time in one spot, not feeding Acorn or Milktop, but instead persistently alarm calling from the direction Skye had headed. It was difficult, but after some time I managed to get a view of her and could see that she was hopping around anxiously above a neighbour's pond. Worried that Skye may have ended up in the water, I quickly made my way over. After a tense wait, I was able to access the garden. Skye wasn't in the pond, but she was sitting on the ground in the open. Just a few feet away was a crouched cat, staring up at Cuvier, who was still alarm calling. By the time it had taken me to realise that something was wrong, locate Cuvier and access her, this had been going on for at least an hour, if not more. Cuvier was deliberately keeping the cat's attention on herself, distracting it from noticing Skye, but Skye in the meantime was sitting exposed, likely waiting for food or guidance from Cuvier. The terrible bind was that if Cuvier flew down to Skye to encourage her to move or hide, she risked revealing the chick's location to the cat. Naturally, it was a deeply stressful situation for Cuvier, and with Acorn now missing vital feeds, of course I stepped in. I gently scooped up Skye and carried her back to my garden, to a location just the other side of the fence from where I found her. Of course, I would never have taken her far from where Cuvier expected her to be. I opened my hand and the tiny fledgling, far smaller than she appears on camera, clung onto my finger for a moment before fluttering to a nearby fern. Cuvier was still alarm calling, not realising that Skye was no longer in harm's way. But when I popped back to make sure my neighbour's garden gate was closed properly, my return scared off the cat, and by the time I headed back to my own garden for the second time, Cuvier had stopped alarm calling. I didn't film any of this because, of course, my focus was entirely on ensuring the safety of the blue tits. With the cat gone, Cuvier returned straight to the nest box to feed Acorn, confirming just how long she'd been forced to delay. Soon after, she called for Skye, who responded from her spot on the fern and fed her too. She then flew off to find Milktop. Calm had returned, but this time Cuvier wasn't taking any chances. She worked in stages to coax Skye high into a tree. Cuvier showed Skye some food and then flew to a spot just out of reach. Skye followed, and as she approached Cuvier, Cuvier flew off again to a slightly higher spot. Skye took her time with each stage, being her first time at seeing this new world, and still practicing her aim. Cuvier succeeded in coaxing Skye up into the tree, and once there, Skye had her first experience of swaying on a branch in the wind. But after such an effort, making her way up to new heights, and after such an eventful day, she soon fell asleep. Interestingly, I had seen a change in Cuvier's behaviour. She had spent much time when feeding the hatch chicks, flying quite a distance to reach oak trees and bringing back bright green caterpillars. Now that she was feeding fledglings, however, she foraged more locally, like with this very interesting meal. That night was Acorn's first night alone, the smallest and least developed of the chicks, without a sibling to snuggle for warmth. Mum's attention was now divided between two fledglings, both in different locations, and Acorn still in the box. For 4 days after Skye had fledged, Cuvier worked tirelessly to encourage Acorn to also fledge. But Acorn wasn't so sure. Acorn was tiny compared to the other two, and she didn't seem quite so practiced with her wings, or at flying in the direction she seemed to be aiming for. As with the other two, Cuvier went through the process of showing Acorn food but not giving it to her, exiting the box, and calling softly from nearby. By this point, I think it's fair to say that the live nestbox community was very much rooting for Acorn to fledge successfully. Acorn was also missing siblings, excitedly hopping around, which would have helped to motivate her. Often, chicks will fledge straight after each other, but Acorn wasn't ready when the other two fledged. On the 6th of June, 87 days after Cuvier and Blue Peter very first checked out the nestbox, and 28 days from the first egg hatching, Acorn fledged. Despite being the smallest, least developed of the three, with less practice flying around the nest box, when she finally plucked up the courage to fledge, she flew the highest and furthest in her first flight, bypassing the fence that Milktop had headed to, and bypassing the section of the garden where Skye had landed, instead flying high up into one of the large trees bordering the garden. Not long after, she made her way back across the garden and hid in some foliage where Cuvier fed her. After each of the chicks had fledged, they were fairly easy to find, sitting somewhere obvious and calling for their mother. However, they each quickly learned to hide, and even though I would have of course liked to observe them, it was encouraging that I could no longer find them, meaning they were tucked away high up in a tree where predators couldn't easily find them. This was confirmed by me seeing Cuvier heading to 3 different areas in turn with food. Each seemed to have their own area in neighbouring trees or gardens. I was then away for about a week and a half, and when I returned, I was keen to see if I could catch sight of the family to see how they were doing. However, whilst I occasionally heard the distant calls of a blue-tit adult and young, they didn't come into the garden. Although I would have loved to have seen them again, it was enough to know that they were around and doing well. Blue-tit parents feed their chicks for a few weeks after fledging, and hearing them nearby meant that Cuvier was okay, and at least one, if not all of the chicks, were responding to her. But then, having resigned myself to not seeing them again, exactly 3 weeks from the date that Acorn had fledged. I was walking through my garden and a tiny blue-tipped fledgling of 3 weeks old fluttered down and landed in the cherry tree, just a few feet away from the nest box she had hatched in. She sat in the tree and looked at me, and I can't tell you how grateful I am to have had that moment. Hearing other blue tits, I ran back inside to get my camera and quickly put some food on the fence beneath the cherry tree. My heart leapt when I saw other blue tits. Interestingly, they were accompanied by a great tit. I went inside and watched from my studio window. I saw 2 slightly larger fledglings fly into the tree in place of the tiny one that had fluttered down to see me. The medium-sized one, who of course has to be Sky, sat in the tree whilst the largest of the 3, who of course has to be Milktop, ate the food I'd hastily put out. Once Milktop had gone, Sky came down to feed. While I didn't have my camera with me when Acorn landed in the tree beside me, I was able to capture some footage, albeit a bit blurry, of the smallest fledgling feeding. Still, it was enough to confirm that all 3 fledglings were doing well. But just when I thought things couldn't get any more special, Cuvier appeared. A few days after this amazing encounter, I had the privilege of seeing Cuvier again. Cuvier must be recognised as nothing short of an extraordinary mother. From the meticulous construction of her nest to the tireless care, protection and constant feeding and teaching of her chicks and fledglings, the signs of her effort and devotion were clear. Cuvier, ragged and radiant, stood not just as a small bird, but as a symbol of perseverance, care, and the quiet heroism of motherhood. Whilst I find all of the instincts and behaviours so beautifully designed into these stunning little birds remarkable, what amazes me most is the parents' ability to listen attentively for their fledglings, recognise their individual calls over all other sounds, and locate them, only to then feed, protect, and so cleverly teach them everything they need to know to survive. This experience was stressful, sad, and at times shockingly brutal. But above all, it was beautiful. And I am so blessed and will be ever grateful to have shared in this family's journey and to have been able to share it with you. At some point, I hope to share some of my more detailed notes about this family, probably in a blog post. So as and when that is complete, I will link it below. In the meantime, if you have any questions at all or any thoughts, I'd be more than happy to answer them and hear them. So please do share them in the comments section. Thank you for watching this video.